There's a version of this story where nothing actually happens, and that's exactly what makes it interesting. Because when a quarterback like Shedeur Sanders starts getting quietly mentioned in trade conversations before he's even taken a meaningful NFL snap, that's not noise, that's timing. And timing, in the NFL, usually points to something shifting underneath the surface. The part that's easy to miss? No one's explaining why now. What stands out isn't the possibility of a trade itself. Teams explore options all the time, especially around quarterbacks. What stands out is when this conversation is starting to exist. Not after a bad stretch, not after a public fallout, not after a clear failure point, just early, almost prematurely early. And when conversations begin before there's enough evidence to justify them, they're usually not about performance. They're about positioning. Somewhere inside the organization or possibly outside of it, there's an awareness forming that the current trajectory may not align with the long-term structure. Not that it's broken, just that it doesn't quite settle. And when that feeling shows up this early, it tends to mean one of two things. Either expectations were quietly different than what's being presented, or something changed after those expectations were set. But here's where it gets more subtle. You don't usually hear trade language around a quarterback this early unless multiple layers of the organization are already thinking ahead. Not reacting, anticipating. And anticipation in the NFL rarely comes from comfort. It comes from pressure that hasn't been publicly acknowledged yet, which raises a quieter question. If nothing has gone wrong, why does this feel like preparation? Organizations don't move quarterbacks early unless there's a structural reason. Not emotional, structural. Because the cost of being wrong at that position is too high to act impulsively. So when teams even entertain the idea of moving on before clarity exists, it usually reflects something deeper than the player himself. It reflects alignment, or the lack of it. Front offices, coaching staffs, ownership, they don't always operate on the same timeline. And quarterbacks tend to sit right in the middle of that tension. If a coaching staff sees development one way, but the front office sees long-term value another, that's where these quiet discussions begin. Not publicly, not aggressively, just in the background. And historically, when that kind of split exists, teams don't rush to fix it. They let it sit. They gather more information. They watch how the situation evolves under pressure. Because moving too early exposes uncertainty, but waiting too long locks you into a direction you might not fully believe in. So what do teams usually do? They create optionality. And trade conversations, even speculative ones, are a form of optionality. They're not commitments. They're signals. Signals that say, we're not fully closed off to another path. And when that signal appears around a young quarterback, especially before he's established anything definitive, it suggests the evaluation isn't just about talent. It's about fit. System fit. Timeline fit. Expectation fit. And those are harder to measure, but they're often more decisive. Because when those don't align, the outcome is rarely dramatic. It's gradual, quiet. Until one day, the move happens, and it feels sudden, even though it's been building the entire time. Which brings us back to this situation, because nothing publicly suggests urgency. And yet, the conversation exists. If this continues even subtly, it starts to change the environment around the player. Not in obvious ways, but in small, almost invisible adjustments. Play calling can shift without explanation. Evaluation standards can quietly tighten. Opportunities can become more situational than developmental, and none of it gets labeled as doubt. But it functions like it, because once a quarterback is seen as potentially movable, he's no longer just being developed. He's being assessed through multiple lenses at once. Short-term viability, long-term ceiling, market value, and that last one, changes behavior. Not dramatically, but enough. Because now, every rep isn't just about growth. It's about information. What does he look like in structure? What does he look like outside of it? How does he respond when things break? Those aren't just coaching questions. They're trade questions. And when a player becomes part of that kind of evaluation cycle this early, it can subtly reshape the path he's on. Not necessarily in a negative way, just a less stable one. Because the organization is no longer fully committed to one outcome. They're exploring multiple, and that uncertainty doesn't always show up in headlines. It shows up in decisions that feel slightly off, a game plan that leans conservative, a rotation that doesn't quite settle, a hesitation that's hard to explain. And from the outside, it can look like normal development. But internally, it often feels different. More conditional, more cautious. And if that continues long enough, it tends to lead somewhere. Not immediately, but eventually. Because teams rarely sit in uncertainty forever. They resolve it, one way or another. The only question is, what triggers that decision? Right now, nothing has actually happened. No move, no confirmation, no clear direction. Just the presence of a conversation that usually doesn't start this early. And maybe it fades. Maybe it was nothing more than background noise. But in the NFL, timing like this tends to mean something was noticed before everyone else saw it. Something small, something structural, something that doesn't fully align yet. And if that's the case, then the real story isn't whether Shedeur Sanders gets traded. It's what made that possibility exist in the first place.